I'd like to introduce Steve Demuth.
I have been a professor at Bowling Green State University since 2000, and I'm in the sociology department. And I have a specialization in criminology. And my research involves looking at how race, gender, and class are treated in the criminal justice system. At the pretrial stage, African Americans and Latinos have much worse outcomes in the pretrial process than white defendants.
Some of us may not be super familiar with bail and how bail works. Would you take a minute or two and tell us how the system works?
Bail was originally designed to try to ensure that people would return to court. In the 80s, there was an additional concern added, which is this notion of public safety. So not just will you show up back to court, but are you a risk of committing a further crime to yourself or to others while you're out? We've known for hundreds of years that attaching money amounts to freedom is a risky proposition, because then the problem with that is that then means that the reason why you may or may not be released has less to do with what you've done than whether or not you have the money to afford to be able to pay to get out. When the Constitution was written, bail didn't really look like the way bail does right now.
This seems to be a point where corporations and private industry sort of meet with the criminal justice system, because there's a whole industry around helping people post bail. How did we become reliant on this partnership?
This notion that there is this use of money to equate money with freedom. And because we know that not everybody has a lot of money, one of the problems is that people would just sit in jail because they didn't have enough money to actually free themselves. And so what ended up happening is you saw the creation of commercial bail. And commercial bail is that for-profit sort of corporate based bail system that involves bail bondsmen and bounty hunters and this whole privatization of this bond system. And what most people don't realize is that it's actually very rare in the world. So the United States is pretty much, it's the only country in the world besides the Philippines that actually uses commercial bail. So in other countries, they chose not to go the commercial bail route. And there were really good reasons for that. It was because, one, if there's a profit-making incentive for bail, then it sort of changes the calculus for people who make decisions about bail. It also leaves the decision about whether or not people actually get out of jail or not to the bail bondsman. So they get to choose who they want to bail out instead of it being the judge's decision. So it's supposed to be the court that decides, but in reality, no matter what the court does, in a system like this, they decide it's really the bail bondsman. You're increasingly seeing a lot of states do something besides commercial bail, and they really are trying to minimize.
What is a system of alternative bail that you're advocating for?
Okay, so first of all, there's no reason why bail has to mean money.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's commercial bail or whether it's bail through the court. So for example, in some states, there is no commercial bail. It's illegal. But they still use money bail, and money is actually used through the court. So Kentucky is a good example of that. You wouldn't realize that Kentucky was sort of a forward-thinking state on bail, but Kentucky hasn't had commercial bail since the 1970s. And so all of their bail is handled through the courts, and so it allows them to more fairly and equally decide what the bail amounts are, how much you have to pay, and whether you get that money back when you show up for court. There's a decent amount of research that looks at whether or not money makes people more likely to return to court.
Yeah.
Also looks at whether or not money makes people less likely to reoffend. And it turns out that there's really no evidence to support the need for money. there's not really, money doesn't really seem to work.
People have families, people have jobs, people have homes. What happens to people who stay incarcerated while they're awaiting trial?
It's devastating. People, there's a lot of research on the effects of incarceration on people and their lives. And it turns out that just after a couple of days, people's lives fall apart in jail. So they lose their job, they lose custody of their children, they lose their housing. Detention, pretrial detention, is essentially coercion. I mean, it's a form of punishment in and of itself, because we know that detaining people is just harmful, but it also increases the likelihood of being convicted, usually through a guilty plea, because people are desperate.
Right here in Wood County, we are in the middle of expanding our jail, but also that expansion has been put on hold because due to COVID, we've been releasing a lot of people pre-trial. That's actually reduced the population in our jail. It hasn't had any overt negative consequences for our community. It seems like we're able to separate the people that should remain in jail from the people that should have the opportunity to show up in court on their own.
And we already use this. So like in Bowling Green, for example, for some misdemeanors, the police officer, instead of arresting you, will simply give you a ticket. It's called cite and release. And they'll basically cite you and say, you know, instead of having to go through this whole process of arresting you and then having you detained and then you having, being so harmful, I think that this offense is not serious. And so I trust that you'll be okay in the community, but you have to come to court and you'll have to handle this just like you would handle anything that you would have handled from having been detained.
Since you're speaking to a hopeful legislator right now, if you were going to make one suggestion for reforming our bail system or pretrial detention, what would your suggestion be?
I mean, I would say it's probably to get rid of money. Just because, money creates a system where it's like a two-track system, where you have the people who have resources and the people who don't have resources. And we know that so much of what happens to you in your life or in your case depends on your ability to be free. And if money is the reason why you're not free, then you're not receiving equal justice.